"Alice will never become part of our family," the mother-in-law said to her daughter-in-law in front of all the guests at the holiday party. But after 3 days, she asked for forgiveness. When she saw the packed suitcases in the hallway, she realized that she was a bit late on the very evening when the whole family gathered in a large country house. Excitement filled the kitchen as everyone got ready to celebrate. The room was filled with the delicious aroma of pastries and spices, and the guests praised the hostess's skills. The occasion was the most joyful 3 years of Dmitri and Alice's life together. They were celebrating not in a narrow circle, but solemnly and on a grand scale. As the parents of the spouse liked, everyone tried to be polite and friendly. At first glance, it might not seem like it, but beneath the surface, Sergeyevna's constant smile was a mask for a deeper sentiment. Sergeyevna's name was Olga, and for a long time, her son, Dmitri, had been harboring a lot of resentment, suspicion, and dislike towards her. Alice could feel the tension in every cell of her body, but she did her best to conceal how much she cared about anything related to Dmitri's mother's mood. That evening, there was an unspoken tension in the air, and the set table felt a bit awkward. Everyone raised their glasses in honor of the happy couple, and then, suddenly, the mother-in-law stood up and said something loudly. "You, Alice, will never be part of our family." These words came as a surprise, and everyone at the table fell silent. The neighbors looked at each other, their glasses raised, unsure how to respond. Alice turned pale, and she couldn't say a word. Dmitri felt a strong reaction inside, but he held back. He turned to his mother, confused, and tried to speak, but she stood with her arms crossed over her chest, as if she wanted to start a conversation. From that moment, a small divide appeared in the relationship turned into something of a rough patch for Alice. She slowly lowered her glass to the table, feeling a bit overwhelmed. Looking from one guest to another, she tried to understand. Dmitri had always been a bit cautious around her, even though the family had known about her son's affair for a long time and supported the idea of marriage, or at least pretended to support it. But this was the most direct and humiliating attack Alice had ever heard. It was as if everyone was waiting for more. And Olga Sergeyevna did not draw out Dmitri. She said, a little coldly, "I just don't get how you could choose to be tied to a man who doesn't seem to value our customs, doesn't seem to understand our way of life, and yet says he's ready to start a family with us." With these words, she was happily chatting away, her spoons and forks clattering as she jumped up, her energy contagious. Several guests tried to calm her down, some even reaching out with a gentle plea for her hand, but Olga Sergeyevna was already on a roll. She felt a mix of jealousy and doubt building up inside her for quite some time. What she usually hid behind her usual calm exterior and polite smile, Alice sat with her eyes down, feeling like she was blushing with shame and resentment. She tried to understand what she might have done wrong. She offered to help with the housework, and her mother-in-law replied with her usual, "Oh, no, no, rest, sweetie." When I was cooking, my mother-in-law said, "I'd rather do it myself." I have a lot of experience when I try to take the initiative in family matters. I felt the unspoken, even though everyone was nodding and thanking her verbally. Now it suddenly turned out that this suspension was not an accident. Poor Dmitri, too. He looked a little confused and didn't say much. He knew his mother was a bit intense, but he didn't expect her to choose such a harsh way to show her frustration. Some of the guests started to stand up from the table. Someone suggested heading outside to calm down. The neighbor sitting next to Olga Sergeyevna gently placed her hand on her shoulder, but Olga Sergeyevna quickly pulled away and repeated, sounding almost angry, "Alice, You'll never be part of our family. This phrase really hit home for Alice. She had a tough relationship with her mother-in-law, and it really got to her. She really tried her best to be on good terms with the whole family of Dmitry. Over the past few years, she had brought gifts for Olga Sergeyevna from her trips, tried to keep up conversations at family parties, and often called on the phone to find out how she was feeling. But now, in front of all the guests, these efforts weren't enough. Alice looked up at her husband and saw his confused expression. Dmitry stood clenching his fists tightly and looking at his mother as if he was ready to defend her. His wife was upset with him, but he didn't know why. Today, his mother-in-law decided to express all the anger she had been holding in, and even Dmitry's father, Viktor Alexandrovich, was shocked. He was usually reserved and calm, but he was clearly distressed. He rubbed his forehead, sighed heavily, and, not finding the words, left the guest house, slamming the door. The guests were left in an awkward pause. It seemed like the holiday had come to an end. Dmitry began to gather his thoughts in order to diffuse the situation. The tension in the room was palpable, and even his firm voice could not bring peace to the air. "Mom," he finally squeezed out. "Mom, why do you say that Alice is my wife? She is the mother of my unborn child." Olga Sergeyevna interrupted him in mid-sentence. "Be quiet. I don't want to listen to this anymore. I know who she is. This is your Alice Sfidu, also modest and in fact." Again, there was a heavy silence. Alice, seeing where everything was going, unexpectedly for herself, decided to get up. She turned to her mother-in-law and, in a quiet but firm voice, said, "Olga Sergeyevna said, let's not take it out in public, okay? If we have any problems, we can talk about them together." It seems like a good idea to avoid a final scandal, but by that time, Olga Sergeyevna was already unstoppable. She turned away, looking visibly upset. "You've already shown who you are," and one guest after another was sent out into the corridor. After a few seconds, there was a knock on the front door. No one rushed after her. Everyone was it ended, even before it really started. After this scandal, a sad silence hung in the house. Alice felt tears of regret in her eyes, but she tried to hold on. She didn't want to look even more vulnerable than it already seemed. Guests referring to urgent matters quickly began to spread out in cars. Someone still tried to calm Alice down and hug her. "Olga Sergeyevna has a difficult heart, but she still loves you both." She nodded, but understood that these words were just a friendly way of comforting her, because everyone could see how much she was holding back. Dmitry tried to be close, but he also looked a bit puzzled. It was clear that he, too, was taken aback by the intensity of what was happening. That night, Alice had a hard time sleeping. She tossed and turned, thinking about all the embarrassing details, especially those words that had been so hurtful. "You'll never be a part of our family, Alice." She replayed every step in her head, every conversation from recent years, trying to find an explanation. Where did she make a mistake? Why did her mother-in-law? Laws can be confusing, and sometimes we all feel a bit lost. Deep down, Alice always felt that Olga Sergeyevna was a bit jealous of her son because he was an only child. Maybe his mother didn't quite know how to accept that. She thought that his love for her was now not only for her, but she didn't think that jealousy could turn into open aggression. Dmitry also didn't sleep well, lay looking at the ceiling, and sometimes hugged his wife in a whisper, saying, "We'll triple everything, and everything will be just fine, my dear." But he also understood that after such a conflict, the bonds of the family would never be the same. In the morning, Alice was so distraught that she barely managed to get out of bed. Even though a new day came, The events of the holiday did not fade from memory. They only gained momentum. The phone rang in the morning, and she was afraid to answer. "I'm just wondering. What if it is her mother-in-law? Who decides to continue the scandal? But friends and acquaintances called like this." Alice didn't want to go into details. She just said that her mother-in-law had a fit of emotions and now everything would calm down. Dmitri insisted that she stay home and rest while he left for work, promising to return in the evening. He hoped that a heart-to-heart with his mother would help settle everything. But for 3 days, neither Olga Sergeyevna nor Viktor Alexandrovich showed up at Aliza's house or at the apartment where the young couple lived. Poor Dmitri tried to call them every day, but his father replied dryly that it was better to postpone talking now. His mother was in a bad mood and needed some time to herself. She sounded tired from the phone call. Viktor Alexandrovich's voice sounded distant, like he was struggling to understand the challenges they were facing as a family. Dmitri didn't want to add to the tension, so he didn't ask to visit, but the atmosphere was still heavy. Alice tried to take care of some household chores, read, or watch something to help her unwind. Even when she wasn't online, the scandal kept playing on her mind. At times, it felt like she was starting to question herself. What if her mother-in-law was right and she had a hidden darkness that she wasn't aware of? We all try to put on a good face and seem our best, but Alice understood this all too well. No, this is just not fair. She has been trying so hard to earn good relations, and then she thought about whether she might never deserve it. On the third day, when Dmitri was away on official business, Alice was sitting in the kitchen. Suddenly, she heard the doorbell ring. She shuddered and opened the door. There was Olga Sergeyevna standing there. Her mother-in-law looked depressed. She didn't have her usual arrogant posture or cold smile. She looked tired and haggard. "Can I come in?" In a tender moment, she posed a quiet question to Olga Sergeyevna, and Alice, her heart heavy with sadness, missed her dearly from within. They made their way to the living room and took a seat on the sofa. Before her mother-in-law could gather herself, she found herself overcome with emotion, tears welling up in her eyes. She covered her face with her hands, the weight of her feelings almost too much to bear. Despite all the resentment she held within herself, Alice couldn't stay indifferent to such a heartfelt display. In a voice gentle as a whisper, she inquired, "I'm just wondering, is it okay for me to bring water?" But there was no answer, only sobs. Finally, Olga Sergeyevna found her composure, straightened her back, and said, "I come to ask for your forgiveness," Alice said, her voice gentle and sincere. She hadn't expected such a turn of events. On one side, these words could be the beginning of reconciliation. On the other side, there was still a lingering resentment, which, while it's impossible to get rid of in a day, Alice decided to put aside. She wanted to understand the reasons, and so she asked, her voice warm and understanding, "For what forgiveness, Olga Sergeyevna?" In a calm and measured tone, she inquired, her voice reflecting a delicate effort to maintain composure. Without meeting her gaze, she quietly confessed, "Mother-in-law, I'm sorry if I've said things that have caused you discomfort. I recognize I might have overstepped a bit, and it's difficult for me to admit it, but I felt like I was losing my son, and it's hard for me to talk about it." Alice understood that St. Ekrovi's words, though spoken gently, still held a lingering concern. "Please tell me where she is." I understand that Alice made a mistake. I know it's hard to discuss everything in a human way and solve things peacefully without breaking down on a public scandal. "I'm here for you, mother-in-law." After taking a little breather, Law still felt compelled to share his thoughts. "You know, I was a little worried that Dmitri might follow you away to start a new life somewhere else. You're doing your own thing, and it's been a while since you've come to visit. I'm starting to feel like I'm missing out on the life of my only child. I always wanted to be closer, but I didn't realize it because I thought you were doing your best to be a busy bee and make sure he was always occupied, without even giving me a chance to speak." Alice felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't say anything. "But no," she objected, trying to speak softly. "I never tried to distance you. I thought that you didn't want to communicate with me. You always seemed dissatisfied when we arrived because I didn't cook like that. I didn't talk like that. I didn't behave like that with guests. I often felt that I irritated you." "My mother, I'm sorry if my comments about in-law stung lips are annoying." She asked, and Alice sighed. "No hard feelings. But you didn't really show me much support." Again, we were both silent. It was clear that both women had a lot to say, and 3 days of silence only made things more difficult. The conversation dragged on, and they continued to sit in the living room. Olga Sergeyevna asked for forgiveness, and Alice tried to understand. They came from the heart, not out of fear of breaking up with her son. When she said she hadn't slept well these past few nights and felt guilty, Alice could barely believe her remorse was real. They talked for hours, sharing their worries and thoughts about being daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law. As they talked, Androva shared her struggles with difficulty. "I'm not asking you to forget everything I said. I know it's hard, and it's not fair, but I hope we can find a way to connect. I'll do anything to make up for my guilt." Alice didn't know if you'd believe these promises to the end. The wound was too deep, and yet she felt some relief. The scandal didn't seem to want to leave behind the quiet but tense atmosphere. Because, in fact, they never came to a final conclusion. When Dmitri returned in the evening, he saw his wife, thoughtful with red eyes from recent tears. Alice told him the conversation with her mother-in-law, and he seemed relieved. "Well, you see, she came to ask for forgiveness, so everything is slowly getting better." But Alice looked at him sadly. "I had the feeling that she was just afraid of losing you and still doesn't accept me." Dmitri realized that old resentments don't disappear so easily and that it takes a lot of time to smooth out sharp corners. However, he gently encouraged his wife to consider giving her mother a chance. "After all, we all want to be part of a loving family, don't we?" She didn't say a word, but she was thinking. Deep down, she knew that Dmitri's words made sense, but she was still scared and in pain. The next few days went by with everyone staying quiet. Alice and Dmitri did their best to take care of everyday things and try not to talk about their mother too much. But Alice couldn't stop wondering if she could really trust her mother-in-law. After everything that had happened, it was hard for her to trust them. Dmitri also hoped things would get better. He thought that if they kept things calm, things would sort themselves out. Besides, he was having a few challenges at work that he really needed to focus on. So, there was some drama in the family. Poor Alice was feeling all stressed out, wondering if it was even worth staying in this relationship. After all, her husband's mother always seemed to put her before her. But then, on the third night, something unexpected happened. It all started with a simple conversation. Dmitri called his mum, trying to understand why she had been so tough on Alice. But from the start, things didn't go as he'd hoped. Olga Sergeyevna, although she did apologize sometimes, kept going back to her complaints. "I already asked for forgiveness, but even if Alice admits that she's mostly to blame, I think she didn't show much respect for our family traditions." Dmitri was losing patience. "What traditions, exactly?" he asked. "Well, for example, in our family, it's a tradition to have lunch together every Sunday, but she's always either busy or focused on her own things. She's kind of pulled away from her family. Do you think I'm not noticing? Dmitri wanted to point out that he's an adult and can decide when to spend time with his parents and when not to. But even that was hard because he didn't want to start. Things got a little heated, and the conversation took a turn for the worse. He said that Alice didn't have to change who she is just because of her mother-in-law's wishes. She has her own life and career, and he reminded her that she shouldn't forget all the people who helped him in the past. Then, he ended the call by putting the phone down and saying in a quiet voice, "I'm not sure why I tried to find a compromise." Alice saw how nervous he was and didn't know how to help him. She was afraid that he would have a conflict of loyalty in his soul. Or he would choose a wife. Or, in the opinion of his mother-in-law, she was there for a strange woman in her time of need. And that's when things started to get a little rocky between her mother-in-law and Alice, as well as between Dmitri and his whole family. Olga Sergeevna always thought that Alice was a bit too much for her son, and Dmitri would stand his ground and defend his wife. Viktor Alexandrovich tried to stay out of it, but he'd sometimes say things that made it seem like he was on both sides. "Let's live together soon," and it made the mother feel upset because she wanted her husband to support her. Alice and Dmitri felt disappointed because they were hoping for more. Olga Sergeevna stopped calling, and when Dmitri tried to talk things through, the mother-in-law only said, "I just need a moment to process everything," Alice said, and began to feel a bit overwhelmed. "It's going to take some time, but I'm sure we can get there." Her mother-in-law just needs to see how close they really are. But how can she do that when it feels like all the bridges have been burned down? After a few days, Alice felt like she couldn't stay in limbo much longer. She knew that her mother-in-law could forgive her, and she was ready to make that happen. Olga Sergeevna asked for a temporary relief, and that's all she wanted. She really wanted everything to go back to normal, but she didn't seem interested in changing her attitude towards Alice. Alice was starting to think about maybe leaving for a little while to live with her parents in another city. She was afraid to admit to herself that she was thinking about doing that. But she noticed that her husband became gloomy, irritable, or on the contrary, withdrew into himself after each conversation with his mother. Dmitri tried his best to act like normal, but Alice felt that he was struggling with the inability to please both his wife and mother at the same time. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, she shared a heartfelt idea. "I'm thinking of taking a little break from my parents for a while. I'm feeling a bit tired, Dmitri," she said with a warm smile. "Why don't we decide things together? Let's check out what's available. Something will change, I'm sure of it. I just have to get my head on straight. I'm so tired of all the tension. We're always on the edge of our seats, waiting for the next scandal." Dmitri didn't say anything. He knew his wife was struggling with the pressure, and he wasn't as strong as he needed to be to calm things down. A couple of days later, Alice was already looking forward to things. Suddenly, if she leaves now, it will show her mother-in-law that she's not quite ready to fight for the family. One evening, Nadezhda, Dmitri's cousin, called to tell Nadezhda that Olga Sergeevna had supposedly complained to all her relatives that Alice had provoked her to a scandal, deliberately exposing her mother-in-law in a bad light. To this story, Alice said, "Olga Sergeevna really took such steps?" Nadezhda said, "I tried to reason with her. I explained that it was unfair, but she seemed to be delirious. She said that you were destroying their family and that now they were supposed to be losing Dmitri. I'm so embarrassed, Alice, that everything is turning out like this," Alice said, her heart pounding like crazy. "I understood that she wasn't really asking for forgiveness. She just wanted to solve the problem quietly. But now she's back at it, spreading rumors about Alice behind her back. When Dmitri found out, he was really upset. He said, "I'll go talk to her and see what's going on." But Alice stopped him and said, "Why is she still so angry? Could she really be better off without Dmitri?" He hesitated, torn between his desire to protect his wife's honor and the knowledge that another visit to his mother might cause another scandal. Ultimately, he decided that it would probably be best for all concerned if he didn't see his parents. He felt a bit of a tug-of-war going on inside. On one hand, he felt this deep sense of guilt for leaving his family. On the other hand, he felt this incredible desire to move forward and focus on his own life. It was as if the couple's bond became even stronger because they held on to each other, standing strong against all the external challenges they faced. But it made him wonder, what was the reason for all this? From time to time, relatives heard rumors that Olga Sergeevna was no good at complaining about everyone. Viktor Alexandrovich called his son a couple of times, kindly asking him to be wiser and not to rush into things, but he didn't say anything that could inspire hope for reconciliation. Things got a little rough for Alice at times. She'd get these headaches that just wouldn't go away, and it'd be a long time before they'd stop. Dmitri thought it was just from stress, but he was worried it might be something more serious. He convinced his wife to go to the doctor, and Alice promised to get checked out as soon as she could. The main work matters have been settled. One day, when Dmitri was at work, Alice was sorting through the mail and found an invitation to a family holiday anniversary of one of Dmitri's distant relatives. Everyone was invited, including Alice. As it turned out, the invitation was sent out in advance, even before the conflict. Alice wondered what would happen if she went, but what surprised her even more was that it seemed that Dmitri's mother had had a hand in organizing this anniversary. She thought about calling her mother-in-law herself and asking directly if they should come. Finally, after some thought, she realized, if Olga Sergeevna wants peace, this will be a chance, and if she's not so friendly, it'd be better to check everything on the spot. Dmitri wasn't so sure about this idea. "I think we might fall into a trap. But maybe this is a chance to sit down at the negotiating table." Alice wasn't sure, but she decided to take a risk for the sake of the only chance: annul the marriage or live in eternal conflict. That's what led her to despair. On the day of the anniversary, Alice and Dmitri came to the same country house where they had once had an ill-fated holiday. The mother-in-law was in a playful mood, teasing Ivashy with some light-hearted words. In the yard, there were already cars of guests, and from the house, a cheerful hum of voices could be heard. Decorations and banners added to the festive atmosphere. Alice felt a warm lump in her throat, and Dmitri, feeling a bit shy, squeezed her hand. "We are together," he whispered. He said they entered the living room, where there were already some toasts, and they caught each other's sideways glances. It seemed like someone was waiting for a new scandal, or maybe someone just wasn't aware of the details. Alice noticed that Olga Sergeevna was standing in the corner, talking with the guests, but she looked clearly tense. For a moment, their eyes met, and the mother-in-law looked away. There was no greeting or smile, just a brief, polite nod. Alice felt a bit uneasy, but she decided to keep going. Dmitri, a bit awkward, helped his wife take her off her outer clothes, and they went to the table. During the evening, Alice tried to stay away, especially since it was a holiday for a completely different person, and she didn't want to bring up any topics that might cause conflict. But she felt the intense attention of some guests, and she saw someone whispering, trying to guess her mood. Alice. Dmitri went to greet the hero of the day, but he soon blended into the crowd of relatives, seemingly immersed in the warm, familial atmosphere. Alice noticed that two older aunts were particularly close to him, always ready to offer their guidance and support. She tried to stay close to distant acquaintances who either didn't share much or openly expressed sympathy. At that moment, she looked at her mother-in-law and gestured to the street, as if inviting her to come out. Alice felt her heart flutter. Perhaps everything would be decided now. They went out into the fresh air, where there were several tables and a couple of guests, but the conversation could be started relatively without unnecessary ears. Olga Sergeevna spoke first. "I don't want, and we are obliged to save face," Alice said, nodding, holding back the rising irritation. The mother-in-law is more concerned not with the inner world of the family, but with her own reputation. "Yes. I'm not looking to cause any problems, and I'm sure you're not either," she answered briefly, and Olga Sergeevna looked around, bit her lip, and then continued. "I heard you were thinking about moving to another city. Is that right?" Alice was a little puzzled. "I was caught off guard by such a direct question, and I really thought about it. But this is my personal business." The mother-in-law raised her eyebrows. "Personal business in your situation?" she said, suddenly stopping to think for a moment as if she remembered that she shouldn't give out too much information. Alice, in her temper, "What position do you mean?" Olga Sergeevna cleared her throat. "Dmitri said that you are planning a child," I said. I remembered that Dmitri sometimes mentioned that they want to have children, but it never came to concrete steps, not to mention pregnancy. And then she realized that her mother-in-law probably thinks she is already pregnant. "No," Alice answered, her tone light and teasing. "We haven't been expecting a child yet. But maybe we would like to." "Let's not talk about this." "You ask about my plans for leaving." My mother-in-law gave a casual shrug. "If you leave, then it's a break with our family. But you understand that long-distance relationships are not restored." Olga Sergeevna's voice sounded a strange mixture of threats and so on. Her voice was expressive as if she was speaking. "Please, don't leave." "But I can't expect us to reconcile if you don't play along with me." Alice felt a wave of protest rise in her, but she decided to hold on. "I don't want to ruin my family, but I can't exist in an environment of endless pressure. I'd love for you to decide for yourself if you are ready to meet us halfway, at least once." It didn't work out to continue the conversation. Other relatives came up to them, congratulating Olga Sergeevna on a wonderful holiday. Dmitri, busy with various conversations, found her only after half an hour. He noticed that she was on edge, and they decided to leave early. When it came to business, Olga Sergeevna didn't even mention Alice, and the hope for a quick thaw in their relationship finally faded. 2 days later, Alice took a step she hadn't had the courage to take for a long time. She packed her bags, planning to visit her parents for a couple of weeks to rest and think about her next steps. When Dmitri found out that she was buying a ticket, he was a bit down, but he didn't try to stop her. Deep down, he knew that cities were a good place for work. "Just come back, okay?" he said quietly, collecting her warm clothes. On the road, Alice nodded, but there were tears in her eyes. She didn't know what would happen in the next 2 weeks. Would she be able to overcome her fear of her mother-in-law? Would she even want to live in such an environment? "I love you," added Dmitri, barely restraining himself so as not to cry. "Me too," Alice whispered. She understood that Dmitri was not at fault in their relationship, but there's some old family drama that's been holding them back. And then, like something out of a fairy tale, a bell rang in the hall. Olga Sergeevna was standing at the door with a bouquet of flowers. Behind her, Viktor Alexandrovich could be seen with his arms crossed. Alice stopped suddenly. Her mother-in-law said gently, "I see you're heading out." Her eyes fell on the suitcases, neatly placed at the entrance. "Yes," Alice answered, her voice warm and understanding. "I'm tired. I need a rest." Olga Sergeevna crumpled up, shrugged her shoulders, and held out the bouquet. "I hoped that we could still talk. Maybe it's not too late to fix everything." Her voice sounded confused, but her sincerity was clear. "Alice." As I gripped the handle of my suitcase, I felt my chest begin to swell with emotions. She felt a range of emotions, from resentment to a longing for a normal relationship. She decided to take a look at Dmitri, who was standing next to her, clearly not knowing what to say. Suddenly, Alice realized that this time, the words weren't too late. They didn't sound convincing to her, though. Too much had happened in a short period, too many fake reconciliations. Before she could answer, her mother-in-law continued, "I'm so sorry I couldn't do it sooner. I talked to my family, and everyone thinks we need to make up." Alice stung her lips. "That's not it. You came not because you feel that way, but because everyone thinks you should." Olga Sergeevna sighed. "I think so, too. It's just that everything doesn't immediately reach me." "I'm sorry," but Alice felt, can she accept this apology as proof of a change in her heart? She knew that if she stayed now, everything would go round and round in circles. Like this in front of the front door, at the sight of the suitcases, Olga Sergeevna realized that time was lost. Alice, looking at her, tried not to burst into tears. It was hard for her to see Dmitri's mother in such a depressed state, but she understood that she was no longer ready to put up with unpredictability. "You probably are. You wanted to ask me to stay?" "What is it?" she asked softly, her voice warm and comforting. Sergeevna nodded her head in agreement, but she stood there, feeling a bit overwhelmed by the situation. She wasn't sure how to respond to Alice's decision, especially since she had already chosen to prioritize her own life. Viktor Alexandrovich cleared his throat and tried to step in. "Let's take a moment to sit down and talk. Let's try to keep things calm and collected. How about we have some tea to help us unwind?" he suggested, but Alice shook her head. "I'm tired of waiting for people to respect me. I'm going to go to her parents." She was surprised at how calmly she said these words. Inwardly, she trembled, but she understood that this was her only way. Dmitri wanted to make some kind of gesture, but seeing that his wife was adamant, he only approached her and whispered, "I'll be there for you as you make your decision, but I can't quit my job. We just paid off the loan." Alice smiled at him with gratitude. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she held back. Finally, Olga Sergeevna, realizing that Alice had already decided everything, squeezed out, "I'm wondering if you might be feeling a bit strongly about me." Alice shook her head with a gentle smile. "I don't hate you. I'm a little tired of your attitude, that's all." The beautiful bouquet of flowers that her mother-in-law brought was left to stand alone on the side, as if it needed to be rescued. The seconds ticked by slowly, but eventually, Alice unlocked the door. The last thing she heard from Olga Sergeevna was, but the phrase hung in the air, and Dmitri helped her take out the suitcases. The door slammed behind them, and from that moment, a completely different stage began for Alice. When she reached her parents, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Life in her parents' house, even if only for a while, gave her a sense of security. Alice's mother and father, they understood the situation, even if they weren't exactly sure what to do. They tried to be there for her, showering her with care and support. Alice cried for a few days, but then she started finding ways to take her mind off things, like having conversations, reading, and going for walks. But deep down, she was still worried about Dmitri. She called him almost every day, and he told her about his work and his experiences, as well as about his parents. They all continued to believe that Dmitri was dealing with problems from her past. Alice was tired and didn't want to come to her parents. Every time she heard about new conflicts, she felt guilty. Maybe she shouldn't have left to be near her husband, but she immediately remembered what she had to go through. I understood this decision was necessary to save herself. 3 days later, after Alice arrived with her parents, she suddenly called Olga Sergeevna from an unfamiliar number. Alice answered, not knowing what was waiting for her. The conversation began unexpectedly softly. "How are you doing?" I asked my dear mother-in-law, Alice. She looked a little surprised by the tone, and I could tell she wasn't quite sure when the last time I heard from her was. She quickly replied, "Everything is fine." Olga Sergeevna paused for a moment, and then she continued, "I'm so sorry I couldn't stop you when you were leaving. I really wanted to, but I thought you were just scaring me. I didn't realize that everything had already been decided. I miss you and Dima so much." Alice felt her heart shrink, and it was hard for her, despite the warm welcome from the parents. She loved her husband and wanted to be with him someday. "You didn't want to stop me until I got all the way to the door. You were angry for so long, and I'm sorry," she said. On the other end of the phone, the mother-in-law sighed heavily. "I'm to blame, but I'm sorry. I just wanted to protect my family. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'm sorry for how I've made you feel. I'm sorry for the mistakes I've made, and I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. I'm sorry for everything. I'm afraid I destroyed it myself. I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me. I'd like to ask you to come back and return, not to us, but to Dima. I'd like to try to start all over again." Alice froze, unable to speak. She hadn't heard many direct words from her mother-in-law's mouth yet. But there were some. "I know it's a lot to ask, but is it possible for them to believe this?" Their busy life continued at a distance for several more days. Alice spoke with her mother-in-law several times on the phone, trying to catch the sincerity, but was still afraid of getting burned. Dmitri also called and said that his mother was trying to persuade him to come to his parents' house with Alice and arrange a family dinner to finally clarify everything. "Maybe this is a chance for them to get everything out in the open?" he asked, a little nervously, and Alice felt herself wavering. She really wanted to get things back on track, but she didn't want to get caught up in the deception again. So, she agreed that she would come back in a week when she had finished a couple of things, and then they would go to this family dinner together. "Just don't let her expect me to come running to her." Aliza gave Dmitri a warm, reassuring smile and said, "No one expects an instant reconciliation, just a calm conversation." When the day of the family dinner arrived, Alice felt a wave of fear wash over her. She was riding on the train, looking out the window, and thought about running away. But she gathered herself and decided to try to be strong. She had to check if there was a chance for a future in this family. The meeting took place that evening, with Olga Sergeevna and Dmitri accompanying Alice. There were no strangers in the house, only the four of them, like the closest family. Alice could hardly believe it, but she was grateful for the opportunity. She had been treated almost as an enemy by this family, and it was clear that everyone was feeling a bit tense. Olga Sergeevna tried to start a conversation, but it felt a bit awkward. Finally, Alice said, "Let's talk about what happened and where we're going, because I don't want to find myself in a situation where you might feel a bit self-conscious." Olga Sergeevna might feel like saying in front of guests that she's someone else's mother-in-law. She felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't say anything. Then, the silence was broken by Viktor Alexandrovich, who said, "Olya, We agreed that today we would be honest. Tell me." Sergeevna lowered her gaze, like a schoolgirl caught in the midst of something she didn't quite understand. A gentle warning. It seemed to me that Dima was spending more time with his family and Alice, but she was taking all his attention. "Sorry, Alice. I thought you were doing this on purpose." Alice sighed heavily. "Why would I do this? I, on the contrary, wanted Dmitri to have a warm relationship with his parents." My mother-in-law wiped away a tear. After a long, heart-to-heart talk where they finally got to air all the things that had been bothering them, Olga Sergeevna remembered how Alice once brought a strange gift that her mother-in-law thought was a bit of a joke. Alice remembered how her mother-in-law always had something to say about her cooking. They talked about how hard it can be to be jealous. Dmitri's mother radiated positivity. Despite the fear of losing her son, Alice had her own complexities, and for a long time, she couldn't figure out how to fit into a new family. It was as if their emotions were just barely held back. At some point, Alice couldn't hold back her tears any longer and left the table. Dmitri ran after her, and Olga Sergeevna sat down with their faces hidden behind their hands. Viktor Alexandrovich gently rocked. The evening came to a close with everyone maintaining their composure. Though no one openly argued. Alice and Dmitri left the house feeling tired. He tried to embrace her, but she almost pulled away. How can we find peace in our lives, even when we're faced with challenges and conflicts? Dmitri was unsure how to respond, so he chose to stay silent. He gently held Alice's shoulders in his hands, offering comfort and support. Both of them felt a deep sense of vulnerability in that moment. They were worried that a single wrong step could potentially lead to a breakup. Alice deeply loved her husband, but she was unsure if she could continue to bear the burden of this enmity that kept flaring up and subsiding. Olga Sergeevna never really talked about what the future might hold. She'd say kind words, and then, all of a sudden, she'd stop talking. She retreated into herself. Dmitri was torn between his wife and mother, and Alice felt torn between staying and hoping for the best, or moving away from her mother-in-law, leaving Dmitri with a difficult decision to make. Meanwhile, Viktor Alexandrovich was clearly feeling a lot of tension, and it was evident in his phone conversations with his son. He was struggling with feelings of despair and confusion. "I don't know how we can continue living when there's such a gap in the family," he once said. In those words, there was the pain of a parent who wants happiness for both his child. His wife understands that it's not possible to keep everyone happy. Alice was thinking about moving to a new city, but Dmitri said he loved her and was ready to support her. However, he couldn't because of his loan. He asked his wife to wait until the end of the year. "Let's try to make it work. Maybe something will change by then." That is. Alice gave a nod, but inside, she was getting ready for the possibility that she might have to leave. If her mother-in-law's anger towards her didn't change, it felt like she might go crazy in this tricky situation. A really important family holiday was coming up soon, Dmitri's birthday. Usually, he celebrated it with his parents, but this year, they didn't seem to want to call Alice. Nadezhda is the same cousin who Alice once found out about. Nadezhda's mother-in-law offered to gather everyone at home. "I just want Dima to have a good holiday," she said on the phone to Alice. "And then you can decide what you should do." I invited both Olga Sergeevna and Viktor Alexandrovich. "I'll do my best to create a neutral atmosphere." Alice wasn't sure at first, but Dmitri encouraged her. "This is my birthday, and I can't imagine it without you." Hearing this, Alice agreed, although she felt that she was at risk of being in the center of a new conflict once again. The holiday was surprisingly calm. Olga Sergeevna behaved coldly but politely. and even smiled at Alice occasionally, trying to show that there was no direct war. Dmitri felt more relaxed in the company of After All. He saw that no one was trying to arrange a showdown, which was really nice of them. Nevertheless, Alice noticed that her mother-in-law never spoke to her about the future during the whole evening and did not apologize for her past words in front of the guests. Everything looked as if there was a quiet truce that could turn into open hostilities at any moment. When Alice was about to leave, he said softly, "Sweetheart, I understand everything. I'm so sorry I couldn't be the man you needed when you needed someone to calm your wife's fiery spirit." Olga never knew how to forgive, and Alice nodded with a sad smile, unable to find the words. In her heart, she felt a twinge of bitterness because she had once dreamed of a strong family and found herself in a battlefield where you had to show patience. Soon, a new round of tension arose from a seemingly trivial event. "Alice, I shared some old memories with my dear mother-in-law." He thoughtfully picked out a small souvenir from the trip to show her his appreciation. But Olga Sergeevna misunderstood and took it the wrong way. She called Dmitri and expressed her discontent, saying that Alice was teasing her by sending something that didn't suit their home. Dmitri was taken aback by this strange reproach. He tried to explain, saying, "Mom, it's just a gift. Alice chose it herself, with all her heart." But Olga Sergeevna wouldn't stop. "I didn't ask for any charity. It just shows that she thinks I'm poor. She'll send out some cheap trinkets." Dmitri couldn't stand it. He hung up and again started to shout. Alice saw how nervous her husband was and tried to calm him down, but she understood that once again her mother was the cause. Alice's in-law was on the lookout for a reason to leave, and the family was growing more and more. Alice found herself thinking, "I'm wondering what I'm doing here. I'm wondering how much more disrespect I can take." One of the evenings, Dmitri came home looking a little tired and worn out. He went up to his wife and said, Let's go now. I'll look for a job in your city, and then I'll slowly transfer or even move to another region. I was tired of this pressure." Alice shuddered because she didn't expect her husband to offer such a decisive step, knowing how he always talked about the indispensable connection with his parents. But it was clear how exhausted Dmitri was. As he looked at his wife and mother, Alice asked the main question. "Are you ready for your mom to see this as a betrayal?" Dmitri looked down, feeling a bit sad. "It seems like we're still going to have some challenges as a family if we live here next door, but I'm sure with time, things will get better." Alice gave him a warm hug, knowing that their decision was right for them, even if it came a little later than planned. They started making plans to move, keeping this exciting secret from Dmitri's parents. Dmitri thought about working remotely or moving for his job, but he didn't want to break the ties with his family. They were in complete agreement, but they wanted to distance themselves in order to try to live more calmly without getting into stupid explanations every time. Dmitri thought it would be better to inform his mother at the last moment so that she would not have time to make a fuss a few days before Alice's supposed departure. Dmitri began to pack her things. Large suitcases were bought in advance. Alice quietly put clothes, dishes, and favorite books in them, sometimes pausing in thought, "Do we really have to leave everything here? Our friends, our familiar neighborhood?" She felt that otherwise, their life would turn into hell. Dmitri also sometimes stopped with a sad look, thinking about how his parents would take the news. Yet they were determined to leave, even at the very moment when the last suitcase was in the hallway and the train for which I was supposed to leave the train station in a couple of hours. The doorbell rang again. Alice glanced at Dmitri. "Again, your mother," she suggested. Dmitri Zavin said, "Perhaps it would be better if we didn't open it." The call was repeated, and Alice was still on her way to open the door. When she finally stepped inside, she saw Olga Sergeevna, who appeared to already be aware of their plans, standing next to Viktor Alexandrovich. They noticed the suitcases at the entrance, and the mother-in-law, raising her eyes to them, squeezed out, "You have already decided everything." Alice Stashevalas didn't know what to say. Dmitri appeared next to his wife and said, "Mom, Dad, we're leaving." "We'll be calmer this way." Olga Sergeevna reached out to her son with a look of concern on her face. "Dima, son, you can't just do that." But he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Ma. I can't change anything." "I don't want Alice to cry anymore, and you are always looking for a reason to quarrel. We decided to start a new life." Determination mixed with pain. My mother-in-law gripped the edge. She was standing at the doorway, as if she might fall. "I wanted to say sorry. I wanted us to forget everything and start over. I realized I was wrong, but I was just afraid of losing you." "You can stay." Alice felt a bitterness rise in her chest. She remembered all the insults, all the promises, all the eyes. Dmitri put his arm around her shoulders, and at that moment, everything inside Alice screeched hollow. How many of these can we expect? How many of these end up not coming true? She understood that her mother-in-law had finally understood what she had brought the situation to, but it was already late, an hour ago. Perhaps Alice still had some doubts, but seeing this scene, her mother-in-law and father came late, and she understood that the decision had been made. Viktor Alexandrovich looked at her face. "Alice, are you sure that this is final? We really want to." Alice interrupted him. "Yes, we are." I'm sure the silence was hard to bear. The only sounds that broke through were Olga Sergeevna's hoarse breathing and Dmitri's heavy sigh. After a few long, uncomfortable seconds, the mother-in-law finally blurted out, "Wait, don't leave today. Let's talk." She reached out to Alice as if begging for a chance. But Alice just smiled sadly, and, pulling away, she answered, "Time and time again, you've promised that this would be different, that you'd accept me. But you didn't accept me as your daughter. I have a right to be your daughter, and I have a right to live without stress. I don't know what will happen. Maybe time will change things. But right now, I don't know." After saying this, Olga Sergeevna let go of her hand. She knew that the moment was gone forever. Dmitri said something in a tight voice, "Excuse us," and bent down to take his suitcases. He walked past his parents without looking back. They stood for a few seconds. At the threshold, Alice and Dmitri were both confused and devastated. Then the door closed, and they left, realizing that there was no point in fighting for reconciliation. They looked out the window of the train, where the black silhouettes of trees and the lights of small stations passed. Each of them felt a strange mixture of pain and release. On the platform of another city, their friends were already waiting with a car to take them to a rented apartment. At the beginning of a new chapter of their lives full of suspense and devoid of past fears, Alice squeezed her husband's hand and thought, "Well, maybe time will put everything in its place." A few months later, they settled in a new place, which was a big step for them. Alice started a new job, and Dmitri was also able to agree on a transfer. Although their earnings were a little more modest now, they had enough to live on, which was a relief. Dmitri's mother-in-law and father rarely called. They mostly wrote formal messages in instant messengers. At first, Olga Sergeevna did not contact Alice at all, limiting herself to she didn't want her son to get the wrong idea. So she tried to keep her tone light and friendly. But when she checked the mailbox, she found a letter in there. It was written by hand, and it was from her mother-in-law, Pochurk. The letter was long and full of remorse. Olga Sergeevna told her how she felt like she'd been abandoned and how she reviewed her behavior. She also recalled some humiliating words that Alice had said and tried to understand what had happened to her. It was clear that she felt embarrassed about how she'd acted, but she wasn't sure how to make Olga trust her again. After reading the letter, Alice didn't know what to say. All the pain from the past came rushing back. She put the letter down and thought for a long time about what to do. Alexandrovich asked them to come to visit for at least a few days. He said there was a serious reason to talk, and Olga really hoped they could meet. Dmitri remembered that the cost of their departure was a bit of a concern, as they were worried it might be another trap. But thankfully, all these months passed without any scandals. His mother actually wrote to him every now and then, trying to avoid accusations. Alice also calmed down and began to look at the situation more soberly. In the end, they decided to go, but only for a couple of days to look at the situation. When they arrived at the same country house where the embarrassing words "to hell" were first heard, Alice and Sergei felt like the atmosphere had changed. They were met quietly, without grand greetings or coldness, and Olga looked a little depressed but was trying to stay calm. At the family table, tension was starting to rise again when her mother, my in-law, suddenly placed a pack of old photos on the table and asked, "Do you remember Dima?" She turned to her son and said, "Do you remember how your father and I took you to the sea for the first time? And these are your first steps," she told him, her voice tinged with quiet sadness. Alice sat next to her and felt a surge of empathy. She saw the vulnerability of this woman who was once a young mother and had dedicated her life to her son. Then, my mother-in-law looked at Alice. "I'm so sorry that I didn't accept you right away. I'm learning to love in a new way, and it's taking some time. But if you have a child someday, I'd love to be a good grandmother." She said these words, and she was breathing heavily, as if it was hard for her. Alice felt the tears, and she softly said, "I'm not sure if I can forget everything, but let's try again." Right then, they seemed to connect for the first time. By the evening, Dmitri and Alice were about to leave for their new apartment, but their mother-in-law kindly suggested, "Maybe you'll stay for the night? I'll cook something delicious." Alice hesitated, remembering the last time she had stayed in this house, which had ended in a bit of a drama. But Dmitri held her hand and said, "It seems like things are really changing. Let's give it a try." They decided to stay, and the evening passed peacefully, with everyone sharing quiet moments. There was a delicate balance, and everyone was careful not to upset the fragile harmony. At night, Alice found herself awake, listening to Dmitri's parents in the next room, quietly conversing about something. She wished they would let her in, and hoped they weren't just putting up a front for fear of losing her son. She was pregnant. She was shocked, and she sat in the bathroom holding a pregnancy test with 2 clear lines. She wasn't sure how she was feeling. She and Dmitri had always dreamed of a child, and they were so excited to have one. They were so happy that they could raise this baby in a loving and understanding environment. But as she came out of the bathroom, she saw Dmitri waiting for her. He looked so happy, and his face was lit up with a smile. "Really?" he asked with his lips, and Alice barely had time to nod as he took her in his arms. In the corridor stood Olga Sergeevna, who had accidentally become an involuntary witness. She froze, looking at them as if not believing her eyes. Alice caught her gaze and realized that now her mother-in-law realized how much more serious everything would become because the grandson is that true?" And Alice replied with a warm smile, saying, "It seems that yes." And suddenly, the mother-in-law burst into tears. It was a side of her Alice hadn't seen before. She covered her face with her hands and repeated through her tears, "I'm sorry, I don't want to lose my grandson." It was a heartwarming moment of connection. Dmitri and Alice felt like everything was finally falling into place, and this joy could bring their family closer together. But Alice was still a bit hesitant. I saw how many times my mother-in-law's attitude shifted from anger to remorse and back again. They stayed in the country house for a few more days, talking about the future. Olga Sergeevna tried to be gentle, and Viktor Alexandrovich showed concern. Dislike and wounds don't just disappear immediately, of course, but there was a genuine desire to build trusting relationships. Dmitri said they should return to the apartment, and Olga Sergeevna didn't object. In fact, she said she was ready to go and visit them. Alice left with a twofold feeling. The joy of pregnancy can be a time when you might feel a bit anxious, wondering if the past might resurface. After a week, her mother-in-law reached out to her with a kind, cautious question. "Would you be okay with me bringing some of the baby's old toys for her to see?" Alice graciously agreed, and they spent a lovely half-day together, sorting through small vests and baby booties. As they chatted, they discussed many things, gently avoiding the topics that had been difficult in the past. Over the next couple of weeks, Alice slowly began to feel more comfortable with the idea of her life changing. She did everything she could to help her feel at ease, and she was so happy that the moment she'd been waiting for finally arrived in her relationship with her mother. But even though things seemed to be improving, Alice wasn't ready to make things seem perfect. Her mother-in-law had apologized so many times, and yet, that just led to more arguments. But life went on, and Alice was thinking more and more about how she could raise her baby in a loving environment. If her mother-in-law really wanted to change, there was a chance. But if she was just being sarcastic. Once again, Alice was confronted with reproaches. She shared her concerns with Dmitri over and over, and he tried to reassure her. "Now, my mother understands that her grandson is her happiness. She would never risk that." Alice hoped that would be the case. By the middle of her pregnancy, Alice had already stopped traveling long distances, and Olga Sergeevna began to visit them more and more often. She brought fruits, vitamins, and asked about her health, wanting to be a part of her future grandson's life. Sometimes this annoyed Alice, but she tried to be grateful because she saw how important it was to her. "I'm so glad to tell you that the conflict has been frozen." Sometimes, Alice would find herself looking at her mother-in-law and remembering that fateful night on the doorstep. "You, Alice, will never be a part of our family," she said, her voice tinged with concern. But she saw that Olga Sergeevna herself was trying to smooth out every sharp corner, as if fearing a new explosion. Once, when Alice was already feeling the first tremors of the baby, they all sat down at the table, discussing the upcoming troubles, the nursery, the stroller where Alice would give birth. And then, in the middle of the conversation, Olga Sergeevna suddenly said, in a tone that was both serious and supportive, "Alice, I would like you to finally feel that you are one of us." "Yes, I know I said a lot of things that might have been offensive, but please believe me when I say that I understood that you and Dima are a family." Alice felt that these words were important to her, but she answered, "I know it's hard for me to believe, especially after everything I've been through, but I'm doing my best. I really want you to know, Alice, that if there's something you don't like or something's bothering you, you should always let me know. I'm here for you, and I don't want to lose you." For the first time, Alice felt warmth, not irritation or suspicion, but sincere warmth. Maybe the mother-in-law spoke to her for the first time, not trying to dictate, but offering support. Inside Alice, as if something had switched, she suddenly realized that the person who once wanted to humiliate her now goes to meet her halfway. And this decision of the mother-in-law. It's clear that in-law doesn't seem to be played at all. As time passed, people became part of the past. Olga Sergeevna no longer made disparaging remarks, and Viktor Alexandrovich tried to help. Dmitry was happy that his wife and mother could finally communicate openly. But the main thing is that Alice also changed. She stopped being constantly wary and learned to accept the care of her mother-in-law. She answered with gratitude and a smile. I'm wondering if all this is just for now. A couple of weeks before the birth, Olga Sergeevna started getting involved in the plans for choosing Radim and the doctor, which made Alice feel a bit uneasy. She finally told her mother-in-law, I need to go to the doctor. It's really important to figure out what's best for you and your baby when it's time to give birth. I'm here to support you, but it's okay to ask for help when you need it. The mother-in-law's face showed a moment of concern, but she quickly composed herself and replied with a gentle sigh. This was a short but meaningful conversation that Alice read in her mother-in-law's eyes showed that she was really learning to respect her choice. And now the day had come when Aliza was admitted to the hospital. Dmitry was there to support her during the contractions. It was a long, painful hour when the line between the past life and the new one seemed to pass. When everything was over and the baby's cry rang out in the room, Alice began to cry, feeling an amazing happiness, and at the same time, Dmitry was overjoyed to see his son in the hands of the midwife, and the emotion overwhelmed him. Olga was waiting in the corridor. She was on the verge of tears after learning about the birth of her grandson. Running up to the doctor, she asked if she needed to buy anything or help in some way. Then, at the first opportunity, she went to Alizia, although this is usually not allowed. Immediately standing by her bed, she said only, "Thank you so much for your son." Alice, feeling tired, looked at her mother-in-law. Suddenly, she had a thought. You know, at this moment, I really feel like I'm part of their family. My mother-in-law's eyes showed nothing but love for her grandson, and she was filled with gratitude for her daughter-in-law, who gave her this miracle. The first months of the baby's life were a bit rough, but Olga Sergeevna was there every now and then, helping out with shopping. Alice herself noticed that sometimes the mother-in-law tries to hold back when she feels like she wants to get involved in something. Dmitry was so happy that he and his beloved women had created a real world together. Of course, things could have gone differently if Alice hadn't made it so clear that she wouldn't put up with humiliation by leaving. But now, looking at the smiling baby, after going through such a difficult time, it was wonderful to see that all the pain and struggle had been worth it. 6 months after giving birth, Alice and Dmitry once again came to their parents' country house to visit their grandparents. The baby was able to enjoy the fresh air and space, which was really nice. Olga Sergeevna was a little hesitant when she picked up her grandson, but Alice smiled and said something that made her feel better. You know, Alice, I remember saying that you would never be part of our family, but I'm here to say that you are. I hope you can forgive me. He sighed deeply, remembering that fateful holiday and the suitcases in the hallway when everything almost came crashing down. Then, he replied, I've forgiven her, but I won't forget it, so it doesn't happen again. She sounded confident because now she knew that she could stand up for herself. They went for a walk in the garden, talking about the most ordinary things, and Alice felt some kind of peace. Dmitry walked next to her, carrying the baby in his arms. Viktor Alexandrovich slowly followed, saying something about new flower beds, and in this picture, everything looked like an image of a real, friendly family. Maybe for the first time since her marriage, Alice felt, yes, now, she's finally inside this circle, no longer outside, facing the stares of those who might disapprove. It's hard to say how long it took them, the scandals and sobs, to get to this point. But now that the sun is shining and the baby's happily turning his head, it's as if he's watching the trees. Alice thinks that maybe all the tests were just what the mother needed. She had found her own firmness, character, and self-confidence, and she was grateful for that. Later on, when the house was quiet and everyone went to their rooms, Alice snuggled up to Dmitri. "Do you remember how I was already standing on the threshold with my suitcases? Your mother appeared too late. But probably without this, we would not have come to today." Dmitri kissed her on the forehead and whispered, "I would have followed you anyway. I couldn't have lived without you. I just wish it hadn't turned out this painful way," Alice replied, her voice quivering slightly as she struggled to hold back her tears. "You know, the main thing is that now everything is different. They've been on quite a journey, moving from hatred and distrust to, even if not simple, real reconciliation. What's truly important is that Olga Sergeevna now sees Alice not as an enemy, but as a person without whom her family wouldn't be complete." And Alice, herself, looking into her mother-in-law's eyes. "Then, in the depths of my soul, I left it. I had this cautious feeling that I should be on my guard, but my love for my husband and child outweighed all the old shadows. So, they finally became a family.